This is Codex Machina, a podcast where we discuss reading, publishing, and all things books.
So welcome everyone to Codex Machina. We're joined today by our guest, Christina Neuwirth, a researcher, writer, and bookseller based in Edinburgh. Don't forget to check out our other episodes with Christina, in which we discussed our novella Amphibian. Today, we're going to be talking about some of Christina's research, more specifically, the recently published Quine Report. Christina, thanks for joining us. As a way of getting started, can you maybe just tell us a few things about the Quine Report? Like, what is it? How did you publish it? How did you do the research for it?
Thank you for having me. It's so nice to be back on the podcast. So the Quine Report is a 40-ish page document that is the kind of headline findings from my PhD research. So I conducted my PhD at University of Stirling, University of Glasgow and Scottish Book Trust, generously funded by a creative economies studentship from the Arts and Humanities Research Council here in the UK. And so the Quine Report really speaks to the literary industry, which I understand like anyone who works in literature, but I guess specifically it's talking to people who run organizations or work in organizations. And also I really wanted it to speak directly to authors and just give everyone in the literary industry who makes any decisions whatsoever some information. And the information I wanted to give them is about gender inequality in the Scottish publishing industry, which is what my PhD was about. And the Quine Report has the headline findings from 2017 to 2019 about publishing, reviewing, and literary festivals, or selected literary festivals, and then over a century of literary prizes in Scotland from 1919 to 2024. And then it also has a lot of findings from interviews with people who make decisions in the Scottish literary industry, just focusing on how does gender inequality manifest in the Scottish literary industry. And then at the end of the report, there are some recommendations and some ideas for taking the learnings from the research forward. And you asked how I published it. So the Quine Report is available for free on quinereport.com. You can download a PDF or you can just read the executive summary on the website itself. You can also download it as a Word document if that makes it more possible for a screen reader to read. I think the PDF is quite designed, so the screen reader might jump around so that the Word document might be more accessible. And then I also published it on Substack as 18 episodes to make it sort of bite-sized and put it right into people's inboxes. And in the Substack version, I also sometimes add extra context or extra graphs. I actually don't know if I did an extra graph, but I definitely did some extra context in some of them, just in case. I know that we're all super busy. And so a 1 page of a Substack newsletter twice a week might fit more into your life to read than a 40-page PDF.
I think that's a really awesome way of doing that, actually. I've, of course, read the 40-page PDF, but I would have absolutely subscribed to the Substack if I had known. And just for everybody's information, the links to that will be in our show notes. I hope it's okay to start off with a kind of a weird question. I ask this question because I had the pleasure of hearing you talk about it when you were visiting the University of Munster last year, in which you were describing some of the difficulties with how do you even research and acquire data about gender when you're trying to research gender equality. And I wondered if it would be okay to ask you to say a little bit about that.
Yeah, of course. So I am not a trained statistician. That is not my training. I went to school for English, and then I went to school for creative writing. And so I arrived in this book studies PhD or publishing studies PhD, just thinking that I wanted to count everything. I think my initial thinking was oh, it's easy. You just count everyone and everything, and then you put the numbers together, and then you have an idea of what's the inequality. So my initial idea was like, I'll count all the writers in Scotland. Of course, you then immediately run into the kind of pragmatic issues of, well, what do I mean by writers in Scotland? And how would I find them? Who would give me the list of all the writers in Scotland? And I was lucky enough to have had a conversation with Melissa Terras, who is a professor in like digital humanities. And we had a conversation about like methodology. And she said, well, if you want to do like a really big data thing, you could, I don't know, maybe get like every single collection of like Scottish writing, the like Scottish writing in the 19th century or whatever. And you could get all these collections and you could just run all the names through like a gender probability tool. I then didn't learn how to do that, but kind of based off of that, that's kind of how I started. Is I had names and then I put them into like the tool I used was called genderize.io. And I would put the name in and then it would spit out like a gender. But quite quickly, I started to feel like extremely uncomfortable about this because my project wasn't big data, because what I ended up doing and what I wanted to do wasn't look at like I think the advice was perfect for if I had been doing like a huge data project, but I wasn't. I basically had like maybe my largest data set is like, I don't know, 1,500 different names, which is a lot of people, but it's not, like millions of data points. But because it was possible to, instead of putting the name into like a genderize, guess the gender of this name tool, because these were people about whom there was biographical information available, that's how I collected their gender data. So like I had a list of names of like, these are the people who were published in Scotland in the time frame that I'm interested in. And then I went through one by one and I found biographical information. So mostly that's if the person has an author website or if the person has like a Wikipedia page or if the person has a page on their publisher's website where they are described. That's how I then collected the information. And I sort of had like a flow chart, and my like gold standard is where the person described their own gender. But most people don't go around saying, hi, I'm name, I am a gender author. Like most people don't do that. And so the like gold standard really then became, are you a member of like a women's writing group? I sort of took that as like, you want me to know with your public information that you are in a women's writing group. Or I guess you don't want me, the researcher specifically, to know, but you don't mind like the public knowing this attached to your professional profile. Most people didn't have that information available where they self-described. So then I sort of went, the second tier was like, has a reviewer described you as like, this male author is writing about this topic? And sometimes they would do that. So then I would use that information. Most of the time, like 90% of the time, I relied on pronouns alone in situations where the author would have had like some agency about how they are being described. So like on an author's website, if they give a bio that somebody else can use, what pronouns do they use about themselves? So that's what I did. But even with that process, so that's trying to like basically collect the information about how does the author themselves describe their gender, because you actually cannot tell from a name. You already can't tell from a name because I think fundamentally any name could be any gender. But also you really, even in the cultural context that I live in Scotland, a name like Sandy in Scotland is more likely to be a man, like because it's short for Alexander. But if you put it in the genderized tool, most of the time it will guess woman. So because I had like very relatively small data sets, it was possible for me to just like find gender information about each person, even though the pronouns also aren't like always accurate. And what I also then wasn't able to collect and didn't collect was, I guess I don't have like a separate section for like transgender authors because I just counted them as women and as men. I had a section for non-binary authors, and that's basically anyone who used pronouns other than he or she. or somebody who was described or has self-described as non-binary. But because of my method, my data can't really show this is how many trans authors there are in Scotland, or like this is how many trans authors are published in Scotland, because I didn't collect that information. I counted trans men as men and trans women as women because that is who they are. And because also like that's how my method like categorized them.
I think it's really amazing to hear you talk about it because this is all the work that you did in order to start doing a research project, right? This wasn't even what the project was. This was just how you had to approach collecting the data for the project. And I think it can be kind of fun for listeners to know how much work really goes into projects like these. And I also just appreciate so much the difficulties of trying to balance like what someone presents publicly, how they would want to be counted on a report like this, when it's not really possible to just go down a list and ask everyone individually. So, thank you for how carefully and respectfully you approached that as much as you could.
So let me clarify this just for our listeners who may not be as aware of how publishing and things goes with regards to these kind of statistics, that there wasn't this information readily published by the publishers, by the book festivals, by the book prize organizations, that you really had to just parse through the info and get this yourself. Like, no one was doing gender data.
That's right. So I spoke with, in all of these cases, actually, except for publishing, you can export like a nice, neat CSV file of everything that's published if you select the publishers and you select the years. So like you can have that as a spreadsheet. But everything else, I like handmade the spreadsheet. I spoke with a researcher who's working on a similar project in Innsbruck, Veronika Schuchte, and the Austrian or the like newspaper archive that she works on, the newspaper art or like the reviews are already in like a table format, and they already say things like publication date, what's the book. I think they also say like word count or something like that, but nothing like that was available in that way for me. So I like just clicked through every single article in the newspapers on the newspaper archive online to then record the name of the author, the name of the book, the name of the reviewer, the date, and that kind of information, which then built the spreadsheet for me to then go away and collect the gender data. And I earlier said gold standard is like where they self-described. Obviously, gold standard would be talking to them and saying, first of all, do you want me to record you as part of this project? And secondly, how do you want me to record you? So I think that that is actually maybe the most ethical way of doing this work. But for the pragmatic reason of, well, I wanted to count it and I wanted to see what was happening. And I needed to for my project because I had decided that I wanted like a quantitative element of assessing the field of literature in Scotland for gender inequality. This is like the closest I could come. But my colleague Kevin Guyan has written two really beautiful books about really like important books about like gender and sexuality data. One is called Queer Data, and then one is called The Rainbow Trap. Rainbow Trap is just published, and it's really about like, I guess, the dangers of holding this information and forcing into categories something that is changeable or maybe just doesn't fit those categories. That's a big recommendation and a big source of inspiration when I read it.
Thank you. Yeah, some of the stuff you were saying reminded me a bit of the Stella account, which I think you also use as a bit of inspiration for how you did your project, right? I actually got to meet with one of the professors who oversees the Stella account, and she took us through like how you actually just open the newspaper and start recording data by hand. And it's a huge amount of free labor that people are doing to try to create more gender equality in publishing. And I think that's just amazing that that's something people want to do with their time. So
Do you want me to start with any category or just give like an overview of the executive summary?
Just an overview. I mean, just with every category and kind of the numbers, because I think it's interesting that the numbers kind of factor the same percentage-wise with each category, which I guess makes sense, but we'll talk about that later.
Yeah, I'd love to. So to start with the longest time period, literary prizes, 1919 to 2024, I counted 12 literary prizes. There were 56.9% of the winners were men, 33.4% were female, and 0.7% were non-binary. So that's that men won these prizes nearly twice as often as women over the course of a century or more than a century. And of all the winners across these 12 prizes, only just under 5% were BIPOCs or were Black or people of color. And you can see a breakdown of decade by decade and prize by prize in the appendix of the report. In publishing, we're seeing a similar kind of ratio, a little bit better. So publishing from 2017 to 2019 is 61.3% male authors, 38.6% female authors, and 0.1 non-binary authors or percent non-binary authors. So that means that it's basically almost twice as many male authors. Again, you can see the full list of genres I counted, or categories I counted in the appendix. For reviewing, I counted 2 major national newspapers, the Scotsman and the Herald, and also from 2017 to 2019. And it's a very similar percentage. So as you said, Laura, so 62.6% of all the authors who were reviewed were male. So that's basically 1.7 times more male authors were reviewed than female authors. The book reviewers is a really, really stark statistic. So 82% of all the reviews were written by male critics and 18% by female critics. And I have a breakdown also in the report of who reviewed whom, which you can see if you're interested. And then the book festivals, I counted 3 book festivals. So the Edinburgh International Book Festival, which is the largest that we have here in Scotland, I Write, which is a book festival in Glasgow, and Bloody Scotland, which is a book festival in Stirling, which is a small city that's focused on crime writing. The numbers here are a little bit more equal. So I should say the Scottish census from 2021 says that 51.5% of the population is women. And so I guess if we were comparing this to someone, to a figure, it would be that figure. Oh, sorry, it's 51.4%. So if we were comparing it, that would be representative of the population. But the book festivals were 52.8% male authors, 45.6% female, and 0.4% non-binary authors who were programmed. What was interesting to me was looking at solo events at I Write and at Edinburgh Book Festival, which tended to skew more male. So on average, the solo events, the gender disparity, the gap between the figures, is 7.2 points higher for solo events than it is for total events. And then I also looked at where these figures overlap, and I found that basically there's 17 authors of all the 1,321 authors published in the time period who appeared in all 4 areas. So that means that they were published in Scotland, received a review, spoken at a book festival, and were shortlisted or won a literary prize. So in this field, that just means they're very visible. All 17 of these authors were white and 11 were men. So that's again kind of the 60-ish percent, 64.7%, and 6 were women. In my interviews, I found that ideas of what Scottish literature is or could be were limited by various things. And so my kind of overarching idea for this report is our imagination limits our actions, which is maybe very obvious, but that's the kind of overarching theme. So the Scottish literary canon still kind of looms quite large, and it historically favors white male authors. And so that idea is what I found so kind of impacts tastemaking. And the second kind of limiting idea is that Obviously, we do exist in a capitalist market, and that capitalist market has thoughts about risk. And so as a publisher, if you're looking to make a profit, you always have to weigh up risk. As a book festival, you have to think, is anyone going to come to this event? Am I going to lose money or make money on this event? But if you're thinking about risk, you're maybe also thinking about who your consumers are. And there was a report published in 2020 called Rethinking Diversity in Publishing, which shows that the ideas of who the consumers are in publishing is extremely limited, and that many publishers imagine that their readers are all 50-year-old white women, essentially. And so they make these assumptions that really cast most of the UK population as not readers. And it really doesn't represent the breadth of who's actually reading, but this is who their imagined reader is for most of their publishing. And so that really limits what's published, and I guess also limits who we're marketing things to, but also assumptions about what a woman's book is limit what we think that we want to read from them. And it's similar for gender minorities. We have an idea of what a trans book is, and there's very limiting ideas of, well, this is the kind of narrative we think we want to read, or we think readers want to read from a trans author. There also are a lot of financial interconnections in the book sector that sort of limit agency or limit ideas of agency over how much programming leeway do I actually have if I'm relying on a publisher to co-pay for an event, right? I have to kind of give over some of my programming. I have to kind of be led by what can I afford to put on. I also found that the two interviewees disclosed being harassed or intimidated in their workplace, or kind of treated less favorably because of their gender or ethnicity, or missing out on opportunities because of caring responsibilities. Women, I found in my interviews that they inhabit a structurally secondary role. So not the leaders of companies, or not always, or often not the leaders of companies. And women's work is also devalued through gender stereotyping. So I basically found that the value of women isn't valued as highly as the labor of men. And therefore, women can't be alone responsible for addressing inequality because they hold limited structural advantage, and their capacity, resources, energy, time, focus is limited by harassment and devaluing. And my last kind of big point is that the publishing industry has a self-image of it being a force for good and being maybe countercultural, maybe a little bit different than other sectors. And in my interviews, I found that there were often ideas of, tastemakers would be horrified if accused of sexism. They would be shocked to be accused of this. And so this really underlined that they have this self-image of, well, we couldn't possibly be doing this because we work for this good sector where we're good people. And I argue that they may believe that their good intentions protect them from perpetuating sexism or from being accused of sexism. However, as the kind of counting data and the interview data shows, that sexism persists through the Scottish literary sector.
Thank you. I think that's a kind of a stark picture of one country's publishing and gender reality. And, we think about other countries and what's going on. And I think especially now that there's a push of the idea that men are getting more underrepresented now, and they need their own publishing companies for just male literature and these kinds of things. And while I don't want to be one of these feminists screaming about, well, but they've been represented, I do want to address the fact that I feel like pulling these statistics anywhere in the world is going to be important over the next few years with the way the cultural vibe is heading towards, oh, these poor men, and this kind of idea that, we need to allow these men to have their say in a world where I think women still aren't getting the representation that they should. It's certainly not 50-50. And so I'm wondering, how do you think we can combat this in moving forward, with data like yours, and hopefully a lot of other people are coming up with similar data, as far as, you give your recommendations for ways to assess and think about this and do better. But it feels like we're in a time where diversity, equality, inclusion is trying to get more pushed, at least in countries like the US and even the UK. So, what are your ideas for, like, pushing against this, helping to fix this?
It's a good question. I think I should say that I think the cultural conversation around whether men aren't being published enough is going in a direction that's very, like, maybe unintentionally ignorant of, like, the whole canon of literature. um, the literary agent Carol Clark has written a really good Substack about this, about like why we maybe shouldn't be focusing just on debuts, but also look at like who has like a really huge like middlist or backlist. It's not just like who's getting the first foot in the door, but also I think the person who set up the publisher that's sort of like the male like only publisher, some of his intentions, at least in the interview, was like to further writing by men who are underrepresented in the literary industry. So like working class men, men of color, disabled men. And so I think what's tricky is like I think this is really good, and I think that he should do that. But I think the way that picked up everywhere, and maybe the way that it's being reported, is like, you know, men aren't being published, which we know isn't true. But yeah, so what do I think we should do? Sometimes I go straight to like, we should just like stop having a publishing industry and we should just start again. And sometimes I go to, I actually do think that many of these things are facets of capitalism and of like how the decisions that are being made because everyone's operating in a capitalist system. So, like what I've said about the financial interconnections, everyone sort of is able to legitimately say, but it's not me, like I can't fix it on my own. It's because of what's being published. And then the publishers can say, but it's because of what the consumers are reading. So I guess my pocket of this is to say, well, if we have a publishing industry, which we do, how can we make like the working conditions for authors and for people who work there better? And if we agree that nobody should be harassed or intimidated at work, maybe that's a place to start. So some other arts workplaces have started in the last like 5-10 years here in the UK have started like hotlines or support places for the workers if they're harassed or bullied in any way. Because in many of these arts occupations, most of the work is freelance. So you don't have a employer who's responsible for your, well, like technically is responsible for your welfare. You're your own employer. And so I think something like that would be useful here in Scotland for the literary sector. And I don't know if it's the role of the union, like of the Society of Authors, which is the largest authors union, or if it's the role of a funder, or if it's the role of another like bigger organization to set something up. But it can't be the case that, as somebody said in my interviews, one of my interviewees told the story of an illustrator who wasn't contracted for illustrating a book because, or like designing a book cover or something, because she was pregnant. Like that just can't be happening. Like we just can't allow that to happen. And I think even if I don't want to acquiesce to DEI legislation being like rolled back, I don't want that to happen. And here in the UK, we have a lot of, there's like laws coming in that essentially segregate trans people from public life, particularly trans women. And so we also just can't allow that to happen. Like we have to, if necessary, just like not comply with whatever guidance or legislation. And because we just can't accept that people are being segregated. But what I was going to say was like, even if things are being rolled back, maybe the thing that we have is each other. And not to go back to the theme of last time on the podcast, but like, I think if we could all join a union, that's a good idea, because we have rights and protections as workers, and our labor is where a lot of our power is, and the publishing industry can't run without that labor. Yeah. So what I think we can do about it, one thing I think we could do is like make sure that the people who are working in the industry aren't being harassed, or like have a place to go, have like access to recourse if that's happening. Also, another thing we can do is to hold ourselves and each other to account. And I don't think counting is going to fix everything, and counting alone certainly doesn't do anything. You have to do something with the numbers. But it's a very grim time out there. And I think we must nurture our community with each other. Like, we have to provide for each other the things that maybe aren't being provided for us from the state. But I think that's a larger suggestion than just literature.
I think encouraging people to speak up also when they are treated in a way that's unacceptable. I think being loud about it, we have to make our voices heard in a huge way and as a unit together, not as separate subsections of humanity, but as one huge group. I think that will make a difference.
We're talking in really broad, big picture stuff right now, but I kind of wanted to take it back to a number I saw in your report, which I think, correct me if I'm wrong, said nearly 90% of people who work in the publishing industry in Scotland are women. So it was 80 something percent, I think. So this idea that people can create a safer working environment, I think there's a lot to that. If women are feeling that they're not safe at work, or that their labor isn't being valued at work, that's something that, even though they're not necessarily the big decision makers of the company, there is a lot they could do because they are a hugely dominant percentage of the workforce.
So the figure is right, but the figure is for like all of the UK, and also that's like people who responded to the survey. I think if you walk into any like literary organization in Scotland, you will see that this is true, that it's mostly women. But that I think the other thing we need is the cultural shift generally, to just like think that the labor of women is worth something, not just in like a monetary value, but like that women have like valuable things to contribute. One of my interviewees spoke of a publisher who she had worked with for a long time as an author being like this male CEO, and everyone who works for him is a woman, and they do all of the legwork, but he makes all the decisions. And that's just like a structure that like fundamentally doesn't value the labor of women. I should say that a recent report did say that in Scotland, like 50% of the leaders of publishing companies are women. Like, I'm not saying we need women CEOs. I'm saying that we all like deserve better. So we should organize with each other. I think you're right, Bethany. If everyone actually like banded together, and we could do something, but we need, like, crucially, we need these men in power to not be immobilized by their like shock, the shock or horror that this is happening, or by maybe feeling defensive that they're being accused of sexism. They hold so much sway, and they just need to actually do something and not sort of be blinkered by the idea of like, well, we work in a good sector, like we're not like an arms dealer, we're a publisher. So even though, side note, like a lot of the large publishers are more connected to arms dealing than one would like to think. But we women can't like fix it on their own, even though there's many of us, or many of them I've shown in the report, and like the research shows that they are like, how are you supposed to organize if you're being harassed all the time, or like if your labor is not being valued? It's hard to be taken seriously, and also It's very difficult to make a change when you're in a structurally secondary position and when the people who make the decisions don't take your thoughts seriously or your emotions seriously. There's a really interesting article by Parnell and colleagues about publicists whose labor is like so devalued in publishing, and we think of them as like, as someone in my research said, maybe we think of them as like, quote, like vapid party girls, which couldn't be further from the truth, but which is the stereotype of like a bubbly, chatty young woman. And publicists face so much harassment. The gendered structuring of these jobs puts them in a situation where they have to perform an emotional role of bubbliness and of cheerfulness and of they have to do a lot of the author care. That's what the article by Parnell and colleagues is about. So while I think there are a lot of women in publishing, it needs a cultural change. But I think at the very least, what we can do is like interrogate whether our intentions match the output. And that's like a really concrete. I know we've talked like big picture and I'm saying culture change, and I don't even know how you would bring about culture change. But I think a very concrete thing that you can do right now, if you're listening and you're a publisher, is you can say, I have super good intentions and I don't want to actively be making things worse. Is you can look at your output. And obviously you have lots of reasons for why your output is the way it is, but you do have a lot of sway. You are the publisher, you are the festival director or whatever. You have a lot of input. And so even though it's true that you can't program an event for a book that doesn't exist, but a lot of books exist, you know what I mean? Like use the agency that you have and just check. I'm not saying you have to be bound by the numbers, but just have a look at them and see if they match what you think you're doing.
Well, I think, another big problem is when you referred to how publishers or how tastemakers are still so reliant on canon. And I think this is a really huge problem, the canon, because while there's a lot of literature out there that's been written that I think is great, and sure, I think people should read it, I think we need to find a way to break from this idea because in the end, that also serves as a stereotype for this is what literature should be. This is what it is. These are the people writing these things. And I think by the time we can't break ourselves from that, but we're also in the, if publishers think their average reader is a 50-year-old woman, where do they get that information from? They're sticking to this stereotype where they might be even more successful if they branch out from that and really look at who their readers are. And so I think, it seems to be an industry that's relying a lot on stereotype. And is that functioning well? Yeah, I don't think it is.
I really see it as a fairly classic chicken versus the egg question, right? Like, if you have this idea of who your readers are and who consumes literature, like, obviously, the purpose of the publishing industry is to sell books. They want to make money, and they're putting out this particular literary canon that appeals to a particular reader. And so that's where they're getting their money from. And it's exactly what Christina was saying earlier about risk, right? Like it would be risky to go out in search of new readers with a new type of book, a book that is built for a more diverse audience. But you don't know if those readers are out there until you put a book in front of them that is appealing to them. And then you might find out that there are many people who would choose to spend their money on a book that kind of bucks tradition a little bit. If you are yourself a person who is disabled or BIPOC or these things, and the only books available to you are about middle-aged white people, what's appealing about such literature to you? Like, obviously, there are some books that are really, really good, that you're gonna want to read anyway, but you also want to see books written by people who are like you. and maybe you'd be more willing to spend that money. So that's what I think is such a weird catch-22 in the publishing industry, is it's too risky to go look for these readers, even though you might uncover this huge financial advantage if you just tried.
Well, and that's the thing, looking for readers, understanding who's a reader, every publishing company promotes each book a certain way. And if you underpromote something, well, of course, you're not going to get readers for it. And you're going to assess the risk to be, oh, if I reach out to these readers. So they're ultimately in control of not only their success, but even their risk to an extent. So they could really publicize something that is not a normal day-to-day published novel and maybe get incredible response. And I don't see how that's not worth a risk in today's times with Book Talk and Bookstagram and all these places where people are constantly talking about books. And there's so many self-published authors now that, get quite a following. So it's really kind of maddening that big publishers don't want to break out of this shell.
I think to some extent they are doing that, but I think we can see, for example, from the Publishing Paid Me hashtag that collected a lot of information, that the publishing industry is so weird, is the thing I should say. So there was a recent episode of the Material Girls podcast that I really enjoy, which is like a pop culture with a materialist lens and like applies research theories to pop culture. And they spoke about the publishing industry, and they spoke about how it's so speculative and it's all about like imaginary numbers. And it's just, I think when you're outside of it, it feels really strange. But what Publishing Paid Me did, which was started by the Black fantasy author L.L. McKinney, is that it was a hashtag that encouraged people to share their advance payments. And so for people who are listening who don't know, the advance payment is what your publisher puts on the table when they buy like the right to publish your book. And so this is an advance on royalties. That's what advance is short for. But this also represents the investment they're willing to make, obviously, in you as an author. And quite often, if a lot of publishers are vying for the contract to publish a book, they will outbid each other, or they will like put higher and higher advances on the table. And so this hashtag Publishing Paid Me, and you can still see the spreadsheet with all the responses, collected basically like, what advance payment were you paid for your books? Like, how much did you make? What was the advance? And this transparency is so important because, so what the hashtag showed is that BIPOC writers were just like not receiving the high advances that white writers were receiving. And a lot of like white big name authors, male authors, received like completely like huge advances, way higher than anything that like even extremely established writers of color and women were receiving. Like, just the difference was completely huge. I think especially on like BIPOC writers versus white writers, like the difference was so stark. And so this is the investment that publishers are putting in, which then is directly related to how much are they willing to spend on promotion. Because if they've already put £1 million into buying the rights of your book, they want to make that money back. And so they have incentivized themselves to spending a lot of money on the promotion of that book to make sure that they make that money back. And so this is one of the clearest indications of what's going on is the Publishing Paid Me spreadsheet, because it really, for the first time, like shows us transparently the investment that publishers are making and where they're putting the money. So it's not that they're not publishing like a Black fantasy author or a disabled woman author. It's that the level of the investment is much smaller. And it's just like what Bethany said, it's a chicken and egg. It's like, if you're not putting the investment in, firstly, you're kind of not valuing it. You're literally not valuing it as much. And secondly, if you're not putting it in front of readers, if you're not making the effort to, like in my line of work as a bookseller, I receive a lot of proof copies, or like a proof copy of a book, which is like an advanced reader copy, might come with like a little gift or something, or the representative of the publisher might really tell me about it. And that's quite often how I decide what to read, is because that's put in front of me as the bookseller. If you as the publisher aren't putting the money in to do that, to put it in front of a bookseller who's then going to put it in front of a reader, automatically also already the book doesn't stand as good a chance in the marketplace. So it's completely clear to me why this is being perpetuated. Like, it's very clear to see how it's being perpetuated, I guess. And the question of why is because we value certain types of writing more than we value other types of writing. So when I'm saying I want companies to count, or I want people to count things like gender data or like other data as well, what I actually want is transparency. I don't want them to just count it. I want them to publish it so I can see it and so everyone can see it. And I want them to publish, maybe anonymized, but I want them to publish the royalties or the like advances. And I want them to publish the salary bands. Like, I think we need that transparency to allow us to make a change.
Agree 100%. And I would also like to see the figures on promotion, how much they spend per author would be great to see.
I think we have so many more questions. We could literally talk about this for hours, but I think we probably have to wrap up here. A lot of really great food for thought, and it was really wonderful to hear what you had to say about this research. Any last statement you want to make as a closing thing on this topic?
I know I made counting sound really like, I have a lot of conflicting ideas about counting, but I do think you should do it. I think that I forgot now what the research is about. You know, when you see a crowd scene and like people think that there's more women than there are, or like if it's 60% women, people think it's like 90% women. We can look it up. I'll send you a link if I find the actual study. But like, I think we can have an impression of something, for example, a literary sector. I think if we sit down to see what the actual figures are, and we sort of take away like what's our intention, what's our ideas of what this sector is, and we just look at what the output actually is, I think that is important. And I also think counting for me is very fun sometimes. And so I think that you should try counting next time you see like a newspaper that has a bunch of book reviews. Just like try to do a little count and like see what's happening. It might be different, or it might like confirm what you think. And the other thing that you should do is you should organize with your like colleagues. You must organize. If a rule comes in that is discriminatory, you must not comply with it.
Push back. Yeah.
So
Completely.
let them flood your floor, basically, if we
Yeah.
go back to amphibian.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to get to talk about my research with you. Like, it's been just a real treat. Thank you.
Well, thank you for being with us. Thanks to our listeners for joining us on this. Read more books, but not just any book. You know, go out there and spend your money on the books that you want to see more of in the world.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us and share about your research, and also that you shared with us your novella that we all really enjoyed reading. So we thank you.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.